Well, comrades, I don't need to tell you in some respects that on an almost daily basis there's announcements of mass redundancies, of closures, of temporary layoffs or shutdowns of factories, and of pay cuts run alongside that. And that embraces all sorts of different sectors of the economy. You have the retail sector, which has been blitzed by job losses, even though it's an area of incredibly low pay, one where people are almost afraid to be sick because you face the prospect of being fingered by the employers and told that really you're surplus to requirement if you dare to take time off when you're unwell, which actually adds to the levels of sickness. You've got the same situation in other areas, like in finance, where bank workers are paying the price for the bankers' bailouts of last year in particular. You get mass shutdowns and layoffs in the car industry, traditionally one of the better organised sections of the trade union movement. You get things like Honda, which shut down its Swindon plant for about 4 months on half pay and less, and then managed to bring them back and make a lot of them redundant. You get the Diageo workforce as another example in a highly profitable sector of the economy being shut down. And you get the Royal Mail, which, as I'll explain in a moment, is in the midst of ballot action for strike action over the next 3 weeks to prepare for a national fight on top of the rolling programme of strikes already against job losses, which also will mean a decimation of services to the public. So all of that is an indication of the price of the bankers' bailout, the mass misery for working class people and wipeouts for whole communities. Diageo and Kilmarnock is an example of that, where the for sale and to let signs already festoon every corner of the town, a town of less than 50,000 population. Such is the feel that about 20,000 turned out to march against the closure, and yet the Diageo bosses a couple of days ago kicked that public opinion squarely in the teeth, as we warned they would, and said, tough, we're going ahead with the closures regardless of what you might think about it and the social consequences. And of course we had the SNP government setting up a task force which embraced all sorts of different people, including a study, a research for an alternative business plan, and the business plan that the hired came out with the conclusion that Diageo's proposals were sensible from the point of view of the business. So when you hire these gangsters, you get a gangster's reply, because they'll obviously assist the big employers in the main. And then we have a position where Alex Salmond said that what we're trying to do regarding Diageo is match the financial needs of the Diageo company with the social needs of the community. Unfortunately, even though you could have a mathematical debate about squaring the circle and debates about infinity and so on, nevertheless in the main it's not regarded as possible to square the circle in ordinary life. And it's impossible to match the social needs of the population with the financial needs of giant empires of profit such as Diageo, and that again has been proven, and Alec has had a sharp rebuke from the profiteers in the headquarters of Diageo in London, or Essex I think it is. Now, unemployment is at its worst in something like 20 years. As Andy rightly said, young people are particularly hammered by that level of unemployment. And whilst there's professional people, architects, solicitors, designers and others have been clobbered for the first time, let's burst one myth. It is not a middle class recession. The vast majority of the people made unemployed are low paid, are manual, skilled or semi-skilled workers, and they're still, whether they're in the public or private sector, the ones suffering overwhelmingly from this recession, even though there's other features to it as well, unlike the past. And the whole point I'm trying to convey is that, like Andy, Labour's green shoots of recovery gulf, in fact, could be answered with another cliche, if you want to put it that way, which is that we ain't seen nothing yet. Because to some degree in the private sector, but particularly in the public sector, that is the case. There's talk in the last few days of a 10% cut in the workforce in the health service being required. There's talk of either a 5% or 10% cut in the budget of the entire Scottish public sector. There's talk of a 5-year pay freeze and job losses amongst the 280,000 council workers in Scotland, all in order to try and slash the public debt of £175 billion that Britain now has round its neck, largely as a consequence of bailing out the bankers and their likes. And of course now also it's a vicious circle. Unemployment reduces income for the Exchequer, demands greater investment in things like pittance dole, and it's a vicious circle which they're trying to break by breaking the backs and the incomes of working class people and their communities. And one of the first tasks of the trade union movement, and of socialists I think on this issue, is to puncture the myth, the lie, that it's unavoidable, that it's somehow inevitable. There is nothing in the nature of a divine invention or creation in this. It's a man-made capitalist crisis. It's man-made in the sense that men, it is mainly men actually, in the banks and in the billionaire class have speculated and profiteered for years, and we've paid the price heavily, particularly in the last year or so of this recession, with the bailouts of hundreds of billions from the new Labour government because of its big business agenda. And many also of the companies that are announcing mass redundancies or closures are still wallowing in wealth that they have wrung out of working class people over generations. An obvious standout example is Diageo. For the last 10 years, every single year, they've made over £2,000 million in profits, over £2 billion. They've just announced profits of about £2.2 billion again. And yet, they decide to go ahead with the closures. Royal Mail, which is trying to cut back on its workforce even further, made profits last year of roughly £900,000. Not last year, every day last year. £900,000 in profit, and yet they shed labour to boost that profit margin further. The top dogs in these companies won't suffer, of course. It's a recession for some, but not all. Because you get the example of Paul Walsh in Diageo. He is a pension pot of well over £8 billion. Sorry, £8 million. He also has shares worth £6 million in the company, on top of which he had an income last year. You get different figures for it. One figure is 3.6 million. That's Paul Walsh, who said he had a very open mind to the alternative business plan. Within hours of that, he was in a conference call to America to his cohorts there, saying a lot of the restructuring we've announced, the closures in Scotland, over time will help gross margin. Gross margin is his language for profit. It's the right thing to do for the future, and we've firmly grasped the nettle in order that we do not see gross margin slippage. Well, if you translate that in English, they've made billions already, literally, each year. They don't want to make less billions, they want to make more billions. And to hell with the social consequences and the misery for the whole community of Kilmarnock, for example, given that that's the last and biggest private sector employer. And that, to me, brings us to the second main task in this movement, which is to convince working class people that when it comes to fighting for their jobs, they should have no truck with the idea of trying to appeal to the better nature of the employing class, or to try to somehow persuade them to change their minds in the general philosophical sense. Because Diageo, I've just mentioned how open-minded they were as they boasted about doing the right thing for their gross margins. But it's absolutely right, of course, to campaign for public support. You shouldn't criticise for 1 minute the mammoth task of campaigning that's been conducted by Diageo workers and others in order to build public opposition to the closures in Kilmarnock and Port Dundas. The 260,000, I think it is, who have signed the online petition that Unite the Union organised in opposition to the closure. The marches, the petitions, the protests, in cyberspace and real life. All of that is laudable. All of that is necessary in order to build your case and resist the closures and to try to impact on employers such as Paul Walsh and Diageo, his outfit. But the one sharp weapon that I think can be added to that battle, or one of them rather, is to demand public access to all the secret accounts, the secret company accounts, to see where all the profits have gone, and in some companies where all the public subsidies have gone, to expose them all the better and to build public opposition to closures all the more successfully. In that sense, the slogan of the meeting, fight to save jobs, not bosses' profits, that can be assisted by opening up the books of companies to inspection by the public, and that, I think, is something the union should demand far more forcibly. However, the boardroom boot boys are not likely to listen to public opinion. Diageo has just proven that. They're not likely to listen to that, even if you've added all the facts and figures about their profiteering and the rank hypocrisy of closure at the same time. The only way in which they're going to be halted in their tracks on closures and redundancies is if they're walloped in their wallets. In other words, the most sensitive part of their anatomy. That's the only way in which these outfits are likely to be halted in their plans for bigger profit or preserving and saving their profits in the recession. Because that can be done by a number of ways. Certainly exposing them is one, but by building support also where it's appropriate, if it's that kind of outfit, such as Diageo, for a consumer boycott of the product. Because they're very sensitive to that kind of thing if it takes on a mass scale, given the rely on status, image, reputation, saturation of the markets and all the rest of it. But above all, I think it's a question of hurting them in the profit margins, booting them in the profit margins through some form of industrial action. Now, in many circumstances, a strike is still the only viable and best way to do that, best means of defence. Civil service workers in the past have helped to prevent the onset of compulsory redundancies in the main by taking successive days of strike action. And although they haven't stopped all the job losses, at least we have to recognise the success even when it's partial. And that is a result not of sitting back and trying to persuade, in this case the government, but of taking action. We had Royal Mail workers sometimes successful in stopping the plans, for example, to privatise their enterprise in recent months by threatening strike action against it. But strikes sometimes cannot prevent a closure. In fact, in some circumstances, it can be counterproductive as a method of struggle, where the employer can just walk away and leave a relic on the ground, possibly taking the assets with them to another country or another region of the country to get extra levels of grants. And they're assisted in that by the anti-union laws, and, for example, the use of police to help bus in scabs. That was the situation we encountered at Timex in Dundee in 1993, where rather than staying inside the factory, the workers came out on strike, and the problem was it was almost impossible to stop the mass scabbing on buses. Well, it wasn't mass, but the buses were big. The scabs going in on the buses through mass picketing and the use of the police to counter that. That's why the new development or the new wave of workplace occupations, I don't want to exaggerate how many, but the new outbursts of workplace occupations are critically important to the struggle to save jobs, and very important that we try to draw on those experiences. Now, I don't have time, given that there was meant to be people from one of those sit-ins directly explaining their experience. I don't have time to substitute for that. But some of the most recent sit-ins, I think, can indicate how powerful a weapon it is in given circumstances. For example, it started in Britain and Ireland. The most recent wave of sit-ins started in Waterford Glass on the 30th of January this year. Now, they did so because there was an announcement of closure with 480 jobs to go. Virtually no notice, no redundancy terms, and so on. They occupied the factory, and although they didn't win all the jobs, they won well over a third of them. They saved 176, which is a success compared to just trying to appeal to the better nature of Waterford Glass and its big shareholders. 2 months later exactly, the ex-Ford's outfit Visteon decided something similar. In Belfast, Basildon and Enfield, they decided to close those firms, those factories, those suppliers for Fords. There was a couple of minutes notice to the workers, there was no redundancy terms, and their pensions were frozen. Rather than give up, it started in Belfast, possibly not by accident. They were the most closest to home to the Waterford city. They were inspired by that, they openly say that. They were inspired by that partial success, and they occupied, as did those in the two London places. And that, although it didn't win jobs, it won them redundancy terms. It meant, in essence, they got a year-and-a-half salary each at the end of a month's occupation. That in itself is a result of militant forms of action, including the factory city. Vestas on the Isle of Wight, it was previously non-union. It was previously unorganised as a workforce. The company decided to close down, I think it's actually 3 different factories on the island, and lose over 600 jobs. In the context where the Labour government were announcing 400,000 new green jobs over the next 5 years, these 600 jobs that builds the only wind turbine blades of any factory in Britain was facing closure. At first the workforce was resigned, feeling powerless, just work normally. And then, partly through interaction with climate action activists, a group of them decided to form a campaign committee, tried to hide it from the management. Management found out, but the move to get ahead of the management's plot and plan, and a group of them, about 25 or so, occupied the workplace to try and raise the protest against the closure. And right from the start, they put forward a very advanced demand, one that the SSP would quite eagerly also would put forward in such a situation, which was nationalise this Gordon Brown, as the banner put it. Because it was argued, these are jobs that need to be saved. This is a climate that needs to be protected. And yet, despite the government's promises of job creation on the green job front, they're allowing this to go to the scrap heap. And that's why they demanded that the government should nationalise the factory in order to protect the jobs and to protect the climate in the process. Now, all sorts of methods were used that tried to starve them out. They built a big wall, 7-foot wall, I think it was, barrier, to try and prevent people flinging food into the occupiers. And then they used the law to get them evicted from the factory. But the battle is continuing to this day. They're still trying to blockade the factories to prevent the blades from being removed from the factory, presumably to move where they're planning the production in America. Although there's also a strong likelihood, I think, that they're trying to move to China in order to have cheaper forms of, in this case, slave labour. I think the advantage of sit-ins is that it brings the battle right to the heart of the employer. It can be turned into a massive campaign headquarters. It halts production, but it has the advantage also of having direct control for the workforce over the assets, including the machinery, the valuable machinery. I don't think it applies as the best method on every single occasion, but I think where you've got particularly valuable assets and something that produces goods, then particularly in a factory actually, it becomes a powerful weapon of struggle in defence of jobs and other conditions and issues. During discussion we can discuss examples, including ones we've been involved in, like the Glacier Metal workers sit-in that won outright after 7 weeks in Glasgow in 1996. But that sit-in at Vestas, as well as deserving support, I think brings out some of the issues, such as whether it's strikes or sit-ins. The question remains, what's the alternative to massive closures or unemployment in the midst of a recession? What should workers and their allies actually demand in a battle to save the jobs, whether it's a strike or a sit-in? Now, the leadership of the national trade unions, I think generally, are far too defensive and passive on this issue of the recession. We get, on the one hand, Barber talking about the possibility of riots in the streets if public sector cuts take place, but then on the other hand, they don't even organise a demonstration in support of those with the courage to take such action as the sit-ins and the strikes in defence of jobs. Because I think, at a time like this when there's been many setbacks, even one or two clear-cut victories could begin to turn the tide in the direction of working people and away from passive acceptance of closures and redundancies. Of course, we should expose the rank hypocrisy of companies making mega profits whilst tossing workers on the scrap heap. We've already referred to a couple of examples. But also, instead of tagging along with companies' demands for even more government grants and public subsidies to save them from closure, I think the unions should demand seizure of their assets to make them public property, to make them publicly owned, so as to sustain the jobs. That applies aye to Diageo, but also to the likes of the Bosch and Lomb, that's how you pronounce the contact lens company in Livingston, who the Chamber of Commerce have complained one of the reasons of moving from Livingston to Ireland and to New York for production, it's not because they don't want to produce contact lenses. There's a demand for that. But it's because they don't get the same regional subsidies anymore in West Lothian as they used to. And they can get that in the south of Ireland, for example. They're quite blatant about it, the employing class. And I think that rather than just feed them more and more public subsidies, there should be a demand for seizing their assets, making them public and under public and democratic control. Now, in some cases, what is produced is socially valuable, is vital to the community, and provides jobs. That's where the demand for public ownership and working class control obviously comes into its own. But in other cases, what is produced might not be viable or might not be desirable. But I think that still raises the same fundamental issues and a further one. Way back as far as the 1970s, aerospace workers put forward through their shop stewards committees whole booklets of alternative products that they could produce with the equipment and the skills of the workforce, rather than weapons of destruction and devilish arms for a war, for socially useful production. I was involved in a battle in the late 70s, I'm afraid, in Birkenhead on Merseyside against the closure of a ship repair yard, 625 workers. And we devised an alternative plan of production and put it to the Labour government to nationalise that firm and to then do things like produce stuff for road systems, for street lighting, and for things like kidney dialysis equipment, which the skills and the technology, even without any modification, could have produced even at that time. The trade union movement and the peace movement in Scotland and beyond have produced all sorts of jobs diversification plans, which would actually increase the number of jobs compared to those employed in the likes of fast lane through the Triton weapons and other things associated. So in other words, the idea of alternative products that are socially acceptable, socially useful, and particularly in the 21st century, are green, to put in shorthand, are environmentally friendly, come into their own in the battle against redundancies and job losses. Now, the last issue I'll conclude on is the fact that another thing the trade union movement, I think, is not just defensive on, but has adopted the Trappist monk vow of silence on, is the age-old battle for a shorter working week without loss of earnings in order to create jobs. The 8-hour day was something fought for in the late 19th century. It's one of the things that gave birth to the tradition of strikes on May Day and gave birth to the first international of workers' organisations. But it's still not achieved over a century later by tens of thousands of people in Scotland alone, let alone the whole of the UK. For example, without bearing you with facts, the average working week in this country for full-time workers last year was 42.1 hours. And that's an underestimate, because there's quite often hidden second jobs people don't declare. 1 in 8, however, work over 48 hours. And then that's 260,000 workers in Scotland. And a breathtaking 54,000 workers in Scotland work at least a 60-hour week. Where the hell is there any time left in the week for family life or social life after those appalling statistics of 21st century drudgery? think instead of leading to social progress, it obviously leads to illness at work, increased stress, health and safety risks, because tired workers are dangerous workers. And that is the kind of society we live in, as well as the family breakups it obviously leads to. And I think it's obvious that low pay is one of the reasons people work prolonged hours in the 21st century. But another factor that perhaps needs more exposing is the unpaid overtime. Unpaid overtime. And it's not an aberration affecting the margins. An absolute majority of those workers on long hours actually work unpaid overtime. That's a fact from several studies by the likes of the TUC. 25,000 workers in Scotland last year worked unpaid overtime as part of their normal week. And that, of course, particularly comes amongst the low paid, like I said, but also amongst those afraid of losing their job if they don't comply with the veiled threats that they should work the extra hours or there's plenty waiting for their job outside. The fear of unemployment is a whip used to lash people into such antisocial and dangerous behaviour. So to conclude, comrades, I think the trade union movement should expose the perverse contradiction where there's increasing numbers with no hours of work, and yet there's increasing numbers with far too many hours of work because of low pay or the threat of the dole leading to unpaid overtime, amongst other factors. The trade union movement should issue a battle cry of cut hours, not jobs or pay. Save jobs, not bosses' profits. They should mobilise members around those things, and above all, they should come to the assistance and solidarity of workers who have taken any form of action, whether it be a strike, a sit-in or whatever, and try to assist them in winning the odd victory, whether it's across a whole sector or an individual workplace, because every victory will encourage others. We need the methods of struggle. We need the policies that can raise people's sights to the idea, no, it's not inevitable. There is an alternative. There is another way of running society. We need those. The arguments for socialist measures, in other words, are not a luxury. They're an essential, central part of linking with people to save their jobs and to save their future, rather than saving the profits of the employed class minority. Thanks for listening.